When a racist cop tased his wife Delilah in broad daylight. The system called it procedure, until Shaq exposed what they tried to bury. She said 5 words before the taser fired. Now those same 5 words have turned a city upside down. One man is missing. The truth isn't, and Big Shaq's not playing defense anymore. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was supposed to be a normal Tuesday morning, until her scream shattered everything. Tuesday mornings had a rhythm to them. In the O'Neal household, structured but soft, like jazz played through a half-cracked window. Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq, woke early as always, not because he had to, but because he still believed in starting days before the world had a chance to wear him down. At 6 a.m., the house was quiet except for the chirp of the coffee pot and the faint hum of the city starting to stretch. Delilah was still upstairs, wrapped in her favorite gray shawl, reading something thick and political. Probably about urban zoning or housing equity. That was her fire. She never played the trophy wife role the media tried to assign her. She challenged city commissioners the way most people challenge dinner recipes. She was soft-spoken, but made men in expensive suits shift in theirs. Shaq made breakfast like he always did. 3-egg omelet, turkey bacon, and a ridiculous amount of sourdough toast, more for the ritual than the taste. He texted their daughter Mira, who was away in college, just a simple good luck, kill it today, followed by a gif of a dancing giraffe, classic dad stuff. Lucille, his mother, had already called twice that morning. First to check if he was drinking enough water. Second, to ask if he was still planning to stop by the senior center and speak with her friend Shirley's grandson about getting into college ball. He promised he would. Shaq kept his promises. By 8:30, Delilah came down, kissed him on the cheek, and checked her calendar. She had a quick meeting downtown with the city planning board. Something about zoning for a new low-income housing project she'd been pushing for months. She wasn't nervous. She never was. But Shaq caught the slight crease in her brow when she picked up her purse. He offered her a ride, but she laughed. I need the walk. Helps me clear my head. She left by 9. By 10:30, the sun was blinding over the streets of Westworth, the quiet suburb outside Atlanta, where they'd moved for peace. Shaq had just arrived at the community gym to run a mentoring session for high school seniors, half of whom didn't believe he was actually showing up. He just stepped onto the court when his phone buzzed. At first, it was an unknown number, then another, then a call from Lucille, then the call that froze everything. St. Vivian General Hospital. He thought it was a mistake, maybe a fender bender, maybe someone else's wife. But when he rushed through the glass doors of the ER, past a receptionist who looked like she'd just seen a ghost, he saw her, Delilah, lying there, motionless, wires everywhere, lips pale. There was dried blood near her hairline, a burn mark across her side. A nurse, visibly shaken, said she had been tased at close range, twice, outside a city zoning office. The report called it non-lethal force. The officer on the scene said she had been aggressive and resisted direction. But Shaq knew Delilah. She didn't raise her voice even in argument. Her strength was in presence, not provocation. And what would she have been resisting? Her right to exist near City Hall. He couldn't breathe for a full minute. Not because he was scared, because he was angry in a way that didn't have a shape yet. He was the big man, the gentle giant, the millionaire known for helping kids, teachers, strangers. And now, his wife lay in a hospital bed like a warning. He stared at her fingers. They trembled slightly, reacting to something only her nervous system understood. Her wedding band was still on. He remembered sliding it on her hand all those years ago, on a beach in Santa Barbara, with sand in his socks and hope in his voice. She had told him that day, if they ever try to silence me, promise me you won't. And now here she was, silent. The nurse returned with paperwork, and a line he would hear too many times that week. She's lucky. Shaq didn't say anything. Lucky isn't what you call someone who gets electrocuted by a man in uniform and sent to the ICU. That's not luck. That's survival after systemic failure. Outside, the sun was still shining like nothing had happened. Kids were playing basketball across the street. A bus passed. A jogger with earbuds smiled at him. The world didn't pause. But inside him, something had snapped into attention. He asked for the name of the officer. They said Officer Brantley Knox, a name that sounded pulled from a courtroom drama. Shaq made a mental note, then looked back at Delilah, Her arm had bruises, finger marks, and a red imprint on her shoulder shaped like a stun gun plate. He didn't cry. Not yet. He just stared until the room felt like concrete. By noon, the news had leaked. Not the truth, but the spin. Woman resists arrest outside zoning office. No names, no context. The footage? Under review. Witnesses? No formal statements. Shaq scrolled the article on his phone and saw the passive words smothering reality like wet blankets. Allegedly, appeared to may have. Not once did it say she was a black woman. Not once did it mention her name. He knew this playbook. It was older than any law in the books. Shape the narrative before the truth gets a chance to walk into the room. Back at the house, he found her notebook on the kitchen counter. It was open to a page titled Affordable Dignity, Housing the People They Ignore. Her notes were scribbled, passionate, incomplete. The last line she wrote, "They think silence is compliance. It isn't." Shaq put the notebook down, looked out the window, and saw a patrol car drive by slowly, watching. Then it turned the corner. That night, Mira called crying. She'd heard from a friend before she saw it on the news. "Is she okay?" she asked. Shaq didn't lie. "She's breathing. That's all I've got right now." Lucille had already baked 3 casseroles. She said it helped her process. Shaq didn't eat. He didn't sleep either. He just sat by Delilah's bed and stared at the vital signs like he could will them into stability. At 3:47 a.m., a nurse adjusted her IV and whispered, "I'm so sorry. I've seen this before. Too many times." He nodded but didn't respond. Because in that moment, he wasn't just a husband. He wasn't just Shaquille O'Neal. He was a man standing at the intersection of silence and justice. And the silence was starting to fracture. This wasn't just about a tasing. This was about how fast a system could turn a woman into a threat. How quickly compassion could be labeled non-compliance. How proximity to a famous last name didn't make black skin bulletproof or taser-proof. He knew what had to come next. Not vengeance. Not chaos. But pressure. Public. Righteous. Unrelenting pressure. Because if they could do this to Delilah, in daylight, outside City Hall, what happened to the people no one noticed? As dawn crept into the sky, turning the room amber and blue, Shaq leaned forward, took Delilah's hand, and whispered the only words he could summon. "You're not alone. I promise you, they won't bury this." And somewhere, just as the city began to stir awake, a man in uniform filed his report, unaware that he had sparked a reckoning bigger than he'd ever imagined. Because Big Shaq wasn't just coming. He was watching, waiting. And this time he wasn't just playing defense. She was breathing, but not awake, and every beeping monitor dared him to stay calm. The sound of machines had never meant anything to Shaq before. In his world, sound was rhythm, basketballs on hardwood, sneakers on concrete, laughter echoing in empty gyms. But now, sound meant something different. It meant life, or the thin, fragile thread of it. Each beep from the monitor beside Delilah's bed was like a verdict. Every pause stretched his chest tighter, and each confirmation of her pulse pulled him back from the brink of losing control. He hadn't changed out of the shirt he wore the day before. It clung to his skin with the weight of long hours, silent fear, and unanswered questions. His hands, massive and worn, rested on the hospital sheet beside hers. Hers were still cold, fingers twitching every now and then like they were dreaming their way out of something dark. She looked peaceful. But Shaq knew better. This wasn't peace. This was suspension. A waiting room, between what was and what might never be again. Doctors came in and out. Nurses adjusted things without making eye contact. They didn't need to say it. He could feel it in their silence. This wasn't the first time they'd seen something like this. But maybe it was the first time it came attached to a man whose name made news headlines. Shaq kept hearing the same rehearsed phrase, standard procedure, non-lethal. She'll recover. But none of those words felt real. The word that stuck clung to his brain like barbed wire, was the one the nurse had quietly shared with him, when she thought no one else was listening. Combative. That's what Officer Brantley Knox had written in the incident report. Combative. For standing on public property. For raising questions. For wearing ambition. Like armor. For not backing down when told to shrink. He clenched his fists, and exhaled hard through his nose. He knew what that word really meant. It was code. It was used when the truth was inconvenient. When someone needed to be labeled a threat to justify force, Delilah had been labeled that before. Not on paper, maybe, but in rooms where she was the only black woman. In meetings where she made too much sense for comfort. In neighborhoods where her name opened locked doors. And men didn't like how easily she walked through them. And now, even unconscious, they were trying to make her the problem. Shaq sat back, his massive frame barely contained in the hospital chair. He thought back to when they met. It wasn't glamorous. It was at a non-profit gala for inner-city youth. Years ago. Delilah had been one of the organizers. He'd been the headliner, but by the end of the night, people were talking about her more than him. She'd challenged him on stage about the housing crisis. Told him his money didn't mean anything if he wasn't showing up in rooms that mattered. He fell in love with her in that moment. She didn't care who he was. She cared who he showed up for. That became their foundation. Purpose. They built their lives on it. Quietly. Deliberately. Delilah didn't like cameras. She liked spreadsheets. Budgets. Plans that moved needles. Not headlines. She showed him how to be more than famous. She taught him how to matter. He'd promised her 1,000 things over the years, but one promise had always lingered louder than the rest. They were in D.C., the day after a police shooting went viral. She'd turned to him while scrolling headlines and said, "If they ever hurt me, promise me you won't just stand still." He had laughed nervously at the time. "Ain't nobody touching you." "I'm serious," she'd replied. "They don't care whose wife I am. They see me first as what I am to them. And I need you to see me for what I am to us. And if I'm ever not able to speak, I need you to be loud." He remembered those words now like they'd been branded on his spine. But now he wasn't sure what loud meant. Did it mean press conferences? Legal action? Was that enough? Or would it just get buried like so many others? A soft knock broke his thoughts. A young nurse, barely out of training by the look of her, stepped inside. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked Delilah's chart. She paused before leaving, then turned back. "They said the body cam footage is missing," she said quietly. Shaq looked up. "Missing?" She nodded. "I only know 'cause I heard one of the officers talking to the admin desk earlier. They're trying to call it a technical malfunction." She looked at Delilah, then back at Shaq. "That happens. A lot. But it shouldn't." And then she left. Just like that. Like someone who wanted to help but couldn't afford to be seen doing it. Shaq leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and stared at Delilah again. The bruises on her arms weren't fading yet. Her lips were chapped. There was a monitor on her finger that glowed red in the low light. She still looked like herself, unbroken. But the more he stared, the more he saw something else. A story being rewritten without her voice in the room. He'd seen it before. Trayvon. Sandra. Brianna. Names that once felt distant, now thundered in his ears with terrifying proximity. He thought of Mayra, thought of the day he'd drop her off at a new job, or a courthouse, or a government building, and she'd be expected to act professional while navigating landmines wrapped in smiles. He stood and began pacing. He wasn't just upset at Officer Knox. He was upset at the city officials who let Knox carry a badge with stains on his record. Upset at the city planners who probably shrugged when Delilah challenged them. Upset at himself for believing that money, influence, and goodwill could make a family safe. It was a lie. Another nurse entered. Older this time. She checked Delilah's IV, adjusted her pillow. She looked at Shaq, paused, then said, "She'll wake up when she's ready." "Do they ever really?" he asked. She didn't answer. That night, Shaq pulled up the hospital-issued chair again and sat close. He placed Delilah's notebook on the bedside table, open to the page she had last written. He read her words over and over, until his eyes burned. Then he picked up his phone and called someone he hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Cameron Wells, a former city investigator, who now worked in municipal IT. They hadn't parted on good terms, but Shaq didn't care. He left a voicemail. "Cam, it's Shaq. I need to know where backup footage goes. You said once that no file really disappears. I need proof. I need to find what they're hiding." He hung up and stared out the hospital window. The city lights looked too clean for the kind of dirt that lived beneath them. But he wasn't afraid of dirt. He was ready to dig. Back in the room, the monitor kept beeping. Delilah's fingers twitched again. Not enough to open her eyes, but enough for Shaq to whisper, "You're still here. And I swear, baby, I'm gonna make them see you." Outside, down the corridor, 2 uniformed officers spoke in hushed tones, not knowing Shaq could hear them. Why couldn't she just cooperate? "Don't matter. They'll spin it. Always do. Shaq stood up, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. He didn't say anything, just looked at them. The taller one looked away first. Back at her bedside, he grabbed a pen from the table and wrote something on the last page of Delilah's notebook. You were never combative. You were just powerful. And that scared them. He closed it gently and placed it back beside her hand. Then he sat down, steady and still, not as a man broken by fear, but a man sharpening himself in its fire. Because the next time someone tried to spin the truth, they'd find Shaq waiting, with facts, with fury, and with a name they couldn't bury. He was the kind of man who smiled while stepping on your neck, and called it protocol. Shaq had met his kind before, men with polished shoes, rehearsed grins, and voices trained to sound like concern while hiding calculation. But something about Brantley Knox made even Shaq's stomach turn in a way he hadn't felt since his rookie days, when PR agents told him how to look more neutral in front of certain crowds. Knox's face had been everywhere since Delilah's hospitalization, smiling in past press briefings, shaking hands at ribbon cuttings, walking precinct hallways with a purposeful strut like he belonged more than the law itself. On the surface, Knox was what departments liked to parade: a clean record on paper, commendations for de-escalation, volunteer work in at-risk communities. He knew how to pose with a mixed crowd without blinking, how to quote MLK without stuttering, and how to play both sides of an issue, depending on who was watching. But it didn't take long before Shaq saw the cracks. First, he called in a favor from an old friend, Talia Grove, a civil rights attorney known for dragging half the county's legal files through federal scrutiny. She met Shaq at a diner outside the hospital, slid a manila folder across the table without fanfare, and whispered, "He's protected, that's why they gave him the press-friendly beats." But look deeper. Inside the folder were two redacted reports. One from 3 years ago. A teenage boy stopped outside a liquor store, thrown to the ground for resisting frisk. No body cam footage attached. Another, a single mother handcuffed in front of her children after questioning why Knox entered her home without a warrant. Both cases had one thing in common. Brantley Knox claimed the subjects were escalating. Both had filed complaints. Both were eventually dismissed after departmental reviews claimed procedural correctness. Shaq studied the language. Words designed to erase impact. Sanitized language. Legal fog. But what chilled him was the sheer precision with which Knox worked. Never enough aggression to go viral, but always enough to leave scars no one would see unless they knew where to look. A kind of systemic predator who wore courtesy like a badge and bias like an invisible shield. Shaq returned to Delilah's bedside later that evening, her eyes still closed, her breathing steady, but something had shifted in him. A seed had been planted. The fight wasn't just for her anymore. It was for the pattern, for every person like her, who had been neutralized by paperwork and erased by protocol. The next morning, Shaq took a drive. No press, no handlers, just him and the steering wheel. He went first to a quiet stretch of the South Side, to a barber shop where he'd once spoken at a community drive. The owner, Jarrell Thomas, remembered him. More importantly, he remembered Knox. He used to post up here every other week, Jarrell said, wiping clippers with a towel. Wasn't ever outright violent. But if you looked a certain way, walked a certain way, he had a way of reminding you who ran the street. Once told my nephew he looked suspicious for wearing a hoodie in July. Shaq nodded, noting it all. He asked if any of it had been documented. Jarrell laughed bitterly. You don't file paperwork on ghosts. You just try to avoid their path. Next, Shaq found a schoolteacher named Monica Penn, someone Delilah had worked with on a literacy initiative 2 summers prior. Monica was quiet, cautious, but once she realized Shaq wasn't there to sensationalize, she told her story. Her teenage brother had been stopped walking home from a tutoring session. Knox had been the officer, said he fit a description, asked for ID, then called backup when the boy stuttered. The kid had panic attacks for months after. But the case never made it past intake. You don't understand, Monica said. It's not just the actions, it's the way he made us feel like we were intruding on our own neighborhood. Shaq took it all in. Names, faces, patterns. He saw it clearly now. Knox was never punished because he never gave the system a reason to be ashamed of him. He played inside the margins. Just enough fear, just enough silence, just enough plausible deniability to be promoted instead of punished. Back at the hospital, Talia sent another file, internal emails, leaked by someone anonymous. In them, higher-ups referenced Delilah's incident coldly. Handled. Incident stabilized. Public attention low. One email even referred to her as hostile civic agitator. It wasn't just Knox who saw Delilah as a problem. The city had too. She was pushing too hard on housing, asking too many questions about budget relocations. Shaq felt the rage build again, not in his fists, but in his chest. A growing pressurized sense of duty. He didn't want revenge. He wanted revelation. He called Marcellus Dean, a podcaster who covered community corruption. The two had crossed paths years ago during a scholarship campaign. Shaq knew he'd be skeptical, but he was also fearless. They met in a parking lot behind a taco joint. Shaq handed him the copies of the complaints, the names, the details. You run with it. Don't use Delilah's name. Just expose the blueprint. Marcellus flipped through the notes, eyes narrowing with each page. You sure? Shaq nodded. Just make sure it's the system people get mad at, not just the man. A week later, the podcast episode dropped. The smile behind the badge. A pattern in plain sight. No names, just facts. Dates. Data. It lit up local networks. Knox hadn't even been suspended. But now, questions were being asked. Journalists were showing up at Precinct HQ. The mayor's office issued a brief scripted denial of systemic failure. It only made things worse. But Shaq stayed quiet publicly. He didn't want the story to become about him. He wanted people to dig, and they were digging. Meanwhile, Delilah still hadn't opened her eyes, but her presence was everywhere. In the fire growing in the community, in the fear showing in the eyes of officials, when Shaq walked into public meetings, in the email he received from an anonymous officer that simply read, "You're not wrong, there's a backup of the footage, but they're scrambling to erase it. You have days, not weeks." He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he stared at the ceiling of his guest suite in the hospital, tracing every step that had led here. Delilah had never liked fear-based narratives. People don't wake up for outrage, she once said. They wake up when you make them realize it could be them. Shaq understood that now more than ever. Brantley Knox wasn't just one man. He was the face of a quiet disease, the kind that shakes your hand while marking your file, the kind that quotes the Constitution while stepping on necks with impunity. And now, that face was exposed. Not fully, not enough to bring him down yet, but enough to rattle his comfort, enough to put pressure on the cracks. Shaq rose just before dawn and returned to Delilah's room. He sat beside her, same position, same silence. But this time, he opened his phone and stared at a message from Cameron Wells. It was just an address, an off-site server archive center on the edge of town. And a note: if the footage exists, it's there, but they'll come for it soon. Shaq didn't smile. But he did stand. Because this wasn't about one man anymore. This was about the system that hired him, protected him, promoted him. And if Shaq had anything to say about it, the next time Officer Brantley Knox smiled, it wouldn't be in uniform. It would be in a courtroom, answering for the truth he thought he'd bet. And this time, the city would be watching. The video that could have cleared everything vanished. But not from everyone. There was a phrase Delilah used to repeat when political walls pushed back harder than they should. If the truth makes someone uncomfortable, it's probably the right room to say it in. Shaq heard those words in his mind again, the morning he received the official statement from the precinct. It was cold, calculated and final. Footage for Dashcam Unit 17B on March 4th is unavailable due to a technical failure. Investigation pending. Unacceptable. He read it 3 times, hoping the language might change if he stared long enough. It didn't. Delilah's life had been reduced to an incident, and the one piece of evidence that could destroy the cover story had conveniently disappeared. Not lost, not corrupted, just unavailable. And from Unit 17B, the only patrol car parked at the curb near the city planning office at the time of her encounter. Shaq sat in the hospital cafeteria alone, surrounded by the morning shuffle of coffee cups and half-finished sentences. But the world's noise didn't touch him. Not now. His mind was locked onto one name: Cameron Wells. They hadn't spoken in years. Not since a business deal gone south left them both bruised and bitter. Cameron had been a systems security analyst back then, working for a firm that handled city contracts. But a scandal forced him out, and rumor had it he'd taken a demotion to stay close to the tech grid. Now he was tucked away in the city's public access and records division, filing servers and patching old networks that hadn't seen updates since Obama's first term. Shaq didn't care about the history. He needed Cameron now. And he needed him fast. He called. It rang 6 times before voicemail picked up. He didn't leave a message. Instead, he texted, "Need help. Urgent. It's about Delilah. No cameras. Just me." Less than 5 minutes later, his phone buzzed. One word. Come. Cameron met him in a municipal lot 2 blocks from a DMV satellite office. Low profile, cold as concrete, and gray as regret. He wore a city-issued jacket and mirrored glasses and carried an old laptop case, like it was full of diamonds. No hug, no handshake, just a nod. "Before you say anything," Cameron started. "I know, and I've already been watching the logs." Shaq tilted his head. "You still have access?" "Sort of." They don't realize how deep the old systems are still wired into the backup rotation. Most techs don't. They think when they hit delete it's gone. It's not. Cameron's voice was flat, efficient. He glanced around the lot before opening his bag and pulling out a thumb drive. 17B's file wasn't in the central police server because it got reclassified 3 hours after it was uploaded. Transferred to a holding pattern. Not deleted. Just quarantined. Shaq frowned. Quarantined? They're trying to buy time. Keep it from media discovery. Internal oversight can't subpoena what doesn't technically exist in their pipeline yet. But here's the thing. Once that file hit quarantine, a mirror copy would have routed through a backup array in the municipal planning server cluster. He paused. City planning servers, Shaq. The same department Delilah was meeting with that day. For a brief second, Shaq saw the layers snapping into place like puzzle pieces no one was meant to find. They didn't just hide the footage. They tucked it under the very same agency Delilah had been challenging. Housing, permits, zoning accountability. Everything she stood for was being stuffed in a drawer, sealed with digital duct tape. Cameron continued, lowering his voice. "I have a pathway in, but I can't pull it from my machine. It's too risky. It needs to be done from inside the archive terminal directly, which is located at the offsite server facility." Shaq finished. "I know the one. Near the sanitation yard. Quiet. Secure. No overnight staff. You'll need access credentials. I can get them. But once you're in, the minute you search the storage index for that clip ID, it'll send a ping to the audit log. Someone's gonna know." Shaq didn't blink. "Let them." Cameron hesitated. "This isn't about guts, man. You're putting people at risk. You, me, whoever tipped me off." Shaq reached into his coat, pulled out Delilah's notebook, and handed it to Cameron. She wrote all this before they ever touched her. She was close to exposing a pattern in the housing data. Funds disappearing, reallocated to private developments through shell permits. She thought they'd just ignore her. His voice cracked but didn't break. They did. Cameron read a few lines, then closed the book slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "We pull the truth. Then we bury them in it." Shaq spent the next 48 hours prepping. No security entourage. No press trail, just quiet movements, timed visits, and burner phones. He contacted Talia again, informed Marcellus Dean to be ready for a full public drop. They built the chain carefully. Once the footage was secured, it would be blasted across channels so fast the system wouldn't have time to scrub it. The night of the retrieval, Shaq arrived at the off-site facility, dressed like any other city contractor. Cameron had programmed a temporary badge into an admin test card, bought them a 30-minute window. Inside, the building was colder than he expected. Endless gray halls lined with humming machines. It was like walking through a sleeping beast, its secrets buried in fiber optics and silicon layers. They reached Terminal 7B, a dusty workstation no one had logged into in weeks. Cameron plugged in his drive, bypassed 3 encryption screens, and typed in the archive request. Evidence Retrieval Archive URI, Unit 17. The screen hesitated. Then a progress bar appeared. Restoring data stream. 18%. A thumbnail appeared. Time-stamped. Clear as daylight. The incident. Delilah. Her calm voice. Her hesitation. Her words. "I'm here for a scheduled appointment. Please don't touch me." And then, the pause. Brantley Knox stepped into frame. Casual. Confident. The same smile he wore in his precinct photos. He asked Delilah for ID. She showed it. He stepped closer, said something the mic didn't catch. She took a step back, defensively. Her hands stayed low still. He reached to his belt. Taser drawn. Her final words before the hit. I'm Shaquille O'Neal's wife. Then the trigger.
The video ended. No resistance. No combative motion. Just a woman, asserting who she was, and a man who didn't care.
Cameron copied the file twice. One to a cloud vault, one to an offline device. Then he deleted all trace of the query. This will buy us about 6 hours before they realize someone accessed it. Maybe less. Shaq's face didn't move. That's enough. Outside, the night air tasted metallic. He looked at the city skyline as if seeing it for the first time. Tall, glimmering, unapologetic. And somewhere behind those windows were people who had built careers hiding moments like this. But this one was no longer hidden. By the time they reached the hospital, Talia had already uploaded the footage to 5 encrypted Dropboxes. Marcellus had prepared a podcast blast. Journalists received anonymous tips. The chain had begun. Shaq sat beside Delilah's bed once more. This time he didn't feel helpless. He felt ready. The system had tried to erase her, but they had failed. The truth hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting for someone to care enough to go after it. And Shaq had become that someone. The footage didn't just prove Delilah's innocence. It proved how far a city would go to protect its illusion of control. It proved how a man with a badge could become a tool of suppression. Not with fists, but with forms. Not with bullets, but with bureaucracy. But that illusion was cracking. And the world was about to see what it had tried so hard not to. In a gym full of kids, someone slipped him a USB and a warning. They're watching you now. The gym echoed with the familiar sounds of sneakers squeaking, whistles blowing, and kids laughing too hard at half-court jokes. It was the kind of noise that made Shaq feel human again. Like gravity had loosened, just enough for hope to stretch its limbs. These clinics weren't about basketball anymore. Not really. They were about presence, reassurance, letting the kids know someone like him still showed up, especially when things got hard. The smell of pine-scented floor polish clung to the air, and banners of local sponsors lined the walls above the bleachers. Shaq had just finished a drill demo with a group of 9th graders, encouraging one undersized guard, who refused to stop driving to the basket like he was 6'5". His heart was full, even if the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. Delilah was still in that bed, still silent, still waiting, and even as the kids laughed, he kept one part of his mind tethered to her hospital room. It wasn't until the end of the session, when the kids filtered off to their lunch break and Shaq retreated to the bench beside the scorer's table, that the shift happened. He grabbed his duffel to pull out a fresh towel and felt something that hadn't been there before, a rectangular object, smooth and unfamiliar. He unzipped the side pouch. Inside was a USB flash drive. Black, unmarked.
No note. No tag. No instruction.
Just a drive. His breath paused. He looked up, casually scanning the gym. Kids laughing, coaches organizing cones, volunteers checking clipboards. No one out of place. Yet someone had gotten close enough to slip it into his bag, and they had done it while the entire place had eyes on him. That meant precision, purpose, and risk. He slipped the drive into his coat pocket, zipped it shut, and gave no sign that anything unusual had happened. An hour later, in the back office of the gym, an old supply room with a dusty desktop and outdated antivirus software, Shaq plugged in the drive. There was only one file. Warranted view. He clicked it, and there she was, Delilah, standing calmly on the sidewalk outside the city planning office, just like he'd seen in the archive footage with Cameron. But this was different. This was from another angle, a streetlight camera maybe. It had wider range, clearer audio, and captured not just the moment, but the energy. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't even animated. Her tone was measured. Her posture was still. But her eyes, she was scared. And then came the sentence. I'm the wife of Shaquille O'Neal. She didn't shout it. She said it like a lifeline, a final thread to recognition, a plea for pause. The words weren't meant to intimidate. They were meant to humanize her, connect her, make the man in front of her remember that she mattered to someone. Officer Brantley Knox smirked in the frame, leaned slightly forward, and deployed the taser. There was no threat, no sudden movement, no raised voice, just a smirk and a decision. Shaq stared at the screen, unmoving, until the video looped back to the beginning. He pulled the drive and broke it in half without thinking. It didn't matter. The file was already burned into his mind, molecule by molecule. He dropped the pieces into a janitor's mop bucket nearby and splashed water over it. He didn't trust disposal, not now. As he stood to leave, a knock came at the supply room door. Soft, almost hesitant. He opened it. A girl stood there, maybe 17, braided hair pulled back, clipboard in hand. She didn't speak at first, just handed him a folded note and walked off without waiting for a reaction. He opened. They're watching you now. Be careful who you talk to. There was no signature, just those 10 words. Each one felt like a fist tightening around his spine. Shaq stepped out into the hallway, eyes scanning every corridor, every adult, every face. Suddenly, the world felt different. Less like a gym, more like a chessboard. Someone had gone out of their way to warn him, but more chillingly, someone had eyes on him, enough to monitor what rooms he entered, what bags he touched, and when he moved. The city wasn't just protecting Knox anymore, it was protecting the narrative. And Shaq, without even trying, had become the variable they couldn't control. He got into his car without turning on the radio, windows up, eyes on the rear view. A white sedan passed too slow. A man across the street pretended to check his phone, but looked up too often. Paranoia or reality? He couldn't tell yet, but the sensation was loud. At a red light his phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcellus Dean. The podcast's out. They're gonna come hard now. You ready? Shaq didn't reply. He didn't need to. The answer had already been given the moment he decided not to stay silent. The moment he let the system know he wasn't scared of what they tried to hide. This wasn't about press anymore. It was about clarity, exposure, light. He drove to the hospital and entered through the back. He'd changed his route 3 times, looped through an alley, even swapped coats. It felt ridiculous, but also necessary. They were watching him now, and the message was clear. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous his presence became. Inside, Delilah's room was quiet. The nurse on duty gave a half nod, eyes tired, sympathetic. She'd seen the footage too. It was making its rounds among trusted circles now. Civil rights groups, advocates, editors and investigators were all whispering one name, Brantley Knox. Shaq sat beside Delilah again, but this time he didn't just hold her hand. He spoke. I saw it, he whispered. You didn't flinch. You didn't scream. You just said my name, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He paused, squeezing her hand slightly. This isn't just about what they did to you. It's about who they think they can still get away with doing it to. There were no tears in his voice now. No tremble. Just resolve. Heavy, focused resolve. The kind that doesn't need shouting to shake buildings. Back at home that night, Shaq checked his email. Someone had sent the footage from the USB again, this time with timestamps and metadata, routed through 4 anonymous servers. They were serious. Whoever had risked giving it to him was making sure it wouldn't disappear again. There was also a second attachment, a spreadsheet, a list of complaints filed over the last 6 years, all involving Brantley Knox. Shaq scrolled. Names, ages, resisting arrest, verbal escalation, procedural force applied. But not a single case had moved beyond internal review. Not a single punishment issue. The spreadsheet ended with a single note. He doesn't make mistakes. He makes messages. Shaq closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The city thought it was safe behind bureaucracy, behind badge numbers and body cams that malfunctioned. But it had underestimated one thing. Truth delivered with purpose was louder than lies delivered with rank. He stood, turned off every light in the house, and stared out the window. The street was still. But behind that stillness, something had begun to move. They were watching him now. But they had no idea what he was watching too. And he wasn't blinking. You can either burn it down, or make them set fire to their own lies. The church wasn't large, just old. Its bricks had faded from decades of sun, protest and prayer. Reverend Langston Avery had preached there longer than most of the city council had been alive. The sanctuary pews were worn smooth by generations who came for healing, when laws didn't serve them, and courtrooms failed to see them. To Shaq it felt more like a time capsule than a church, heavy with memory, deliberate in its silence. Shaq had waited until after midnight to come, not for secrecy, but for sacredness. He knew what Langston represented, not just to the city, but to men like him who were now realizing fame didn't make them untouchable. He didn't want advice. He wanted grounding. Clarity. A compass to point toward action that would last longer than a headline. Langston was waiting in the back office, lights low, coffee steaming, his frame slightly hunched but his presence unshakable. His eyes were tired in that way that only men who had lived through history could carry. He didn't stand when Shaq entered, just gestured toward the chair across from him and said, "Sit, son, before your emotions start speaking louder than your strategy." Shaq didn't argue. He sat down, large frame nearly folding into the small wooden chair. His mind was racing. The footage, the note, the spreadsheet, the watchful eyes, the fact that Delilah's name was now murmured behind City Hall walls like a curse, a warning. And still, she slept, her body healing from trauma it had never asked to carry. Langston studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You think they're scared of exposure, but they're not. They've prepared for it. They've practiced the scripts, the apologies, the non-admissions of guilt. You've got a fire burning inside you, and you want to throw it at them. But son, listen to me, they expect fire. What they can't handle is light." Shaq frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," Langston said, leaning forward, "if you make this a battle, they'll reduce it to a riot. If you make this about you, they'll twist it into ego. But if you make it about truth, raw, visible, undeniable, and let the people carry it, not your anger, then they'll have to answer to something bigger than you. Bigger than Delilah, bigger than this moment." Shaq let that sit. He knew Langston was right. The public was fickle. The media could be seduced. They needed something more than outrage. They needed precision. "What do I do?" Shaq asked. Langston didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to a dusty filing cabinet, and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Inside were black and white photographs from marches, protests, bloodied faces, linked arms. One showed Langston himself, barely 20, being shoved by police outside a voting rights rally. "You know what beat them back then?" he said, pointing to the picture. "It wasn't fists, wasn't firebombs, it was cameras, it was testimony, it was consistency. Not just one video, not just one family crying on TV. It was 1,000 small lights turned toward the same darkness until people couldn't ignore it anymore." Shaq's jaw tightened. The system he was up against wasn't afraid of chaos. It thrived on it. If he screamed too loud, they'd say he was emotional. If he stayed too quiet, they'd say he'd accepted it. But if he strategized, if he mobilized with purpose, then they'd be cornered by their own lies. Langston laid out a blueprint, not of protests, but pressure. Organize forums, not rallies. Host town halls and gymnasiums, churches, libraries. Invite the media, but give them nothing scripted. Let real people speak. Let the system hear its echo from the people it tried to erase. Let the city become the witness. "You want justice?" Langston said, staring into Shaq's eyes. "Make the truth so loud, so public, so morally unavoidable, that they have to either admit they failed, or show the world they don't care they did." Shaq nodded slowly. This wasn't a sprint. It was siege. He left the church with new purpose, but also with warning. Because somewhere, someone knew what he was building.
It started subtly, a strange alert on his phone about a failed login from an IP address in DC. Then, a call from Lucille telling him someone had called asking questions about Tamara's university records, pretending to be a guidance counselor. And then, 2 nights later, a low hum outside his living room window, faint, mechanical.
Shaq stepped outside barefoot into the cool night. The sky was cloudless, but something hovered above the tray line across the street, small blinking red, just barely visible in the dark. A drone, watching. He didn't move, just stared back. They weren't just watching him now, they were measuring how far he'd go, how much pressure he'd apply, and more importantly, who he'd trust. The next morning, he met with Talia Grove and Marcellus Dean at a private location, an old church basement now used as a youth tutoring space. They laid out the plan. Delilah's story would be the entry point, but not the whole story. Talia had compiled a dozen other names, citizens with minor charges, questionable arrests, buried complaints, all linked to Knox or officers trained under his supervision. Marcellus had arranged for a live stream platform that couldn't be shut down. And he would appear not as a grieving husband, but as a host, turning grief into amplification. Lucille stepped in too. She contacted church networks, women's groups, senior advocacy boards. Mira, from her campus, rallied students to start threads, petitions, organized Zoom forums, decentralized, hard to block, easy to replicate. Within 72 hours, Delilah Did Nothing trended on 3 platforms. But more importantly, the narrative had shifted, no longer a single event. Now it was a pattern, a system, a wound. Shaq never said a word to the press. He didn't need to. Instead, he appeared in a short 6-minute video filmed in Delilah's hospital room. He sat beside her, voice low, eyes steady. She's not just my wife. She's a community leader, an advocate, a builder, and she was tased not because she resisted, but because she reminded someone in power that he didn't own the ground she stood on. We have the footage, we have the data, but more importantly, we have the people. If they think we'll let this fade into procedure, they've underestimated all of us. The video ended there. No theatrics. Just truth.
The impact was instant.
The mayor's office issued a non-committal statement about deep concern and ongoing review. The chief of police denied any tampering, but the damage was done. Every vague statement now read as deflection. Then came the anonymous leak. An internal memo from the department surfaced, recommending containment and narrative suppression of Delilah's case. Language that sounded more like corporate strategy than justice. It confirmed everything. Langston was right. The fire they feared wasn't the one Shaq could set. It was the one they themselves would ignite trying to protect their lives. And the match had already been struck. By the end of the week, protesters weren't holding signs. They were holding court transcripts. They were reading complaints. They were quoting policy codes. They were speaking the system's language louder than the system could explain itself. Shaq watched it unfold, not from a podium, but from the street, shoulder to shoulder, with the same people who'd once just asked for someone to listen. He'd become that someone. And he was just getting started. He stood before flashing lights, raised one hand, and said the 5 words that cracked the silence. The hospital looked different that morning, not because of what had changed outside, but because of what was building within. Every hallway buzzed with anticipation. Staff walked quicker. Security tripled. News vans lined the perimeter. Reporters staking out sidewalks. Camera crews rehearsing on-air intros. The air itself held attention, taut, waiting to snap. Shaq stood in Delilah's room for the last time before everything shifted. Her condition was still stable, unchanged, but her presence had deepened. There was no longer a sense of waiting for her to wake up. Now it felt like she was waiting for him to act, to speak, to do what needed to be done. Her hand still rested in his, fingers cool and unmoving, but they grounded him more than any stadium crowd ever had. He kissed her forehead once, stood up, and walked to the window. From there he could see the crowd gathering. Organizers, teachers, church groups, students with handmade signs, lawyers holding folders, not megaphones. A sea of people who'd stopped waiting for justice to appear and decided to show up for it. The press conference was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. sharp, and the city had responded with predictability, barricades, uniforms and presence, not protection, pressure, not support, surveillance. The entire front of the hospital had been transformed into a stage, but Shaq knew who was controlling the lights. At 9:46 a.m., the footage was cued to drop. It had already been uploaded to 6 national newsrooms, 2 watchdog sites, and a public archive secured by multiple legal contacts. The moment the clock struck, it would be impossible to unsee or undo. The clip would play uncut, unfiltered, showing Delilah, her words, her fear, and the smirk that answered it with 50. But before that happened, Shaq needed to say 5 words. At 9:55, he stepped onto the front steps of the hospital. The microphones were ready, the cameras tracking his every move. Beside him stood Talia Grove, holding a copy of the internal memo leak. On the other side, Marcellus Dean, streaming live for over 150,000 viewers. Behind him, 2 nurses held hands, not as a symbol, but as armor. He didn't wear a suit. He wore gray, the same color as the sweater Delilah wore the day she left their house. A low murmur ran through the crowd as Shaq raised one hand, commanding quiet without a word. Then he looked directly into the cameras and said, "She told you who I am." 5 words, calm, unrushed, clear as daylight. And in that moment, everything froze. Because those 5 words, the exact same ones Delilah had spoken on that video before Knox pulled the trigger, were already playing in the heads of every person who'd seen the early footage. They were time-stamped, documented, etched in digital truth. And the chilling thing wasn't that she'd said them. It was that he knew they would. That meant he had the footage. That meant the city had lied. That meant the system had been caught. The officers standing near the barricade shifted uneasily. One of the SWAT team leaders, positioned near the mobile command post, tilted his head toward his earpiece, and then froze. Whatever he heard had shaken him. Two plainclothes men at the edge of the crowd slowly backed away into the dispersing shadows of press equipment. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. Shaq let it hang, eyes slowly scanning the crowd, making sure the cameras were locked in. Then he continued, "She told you who I am, and you didn't care. You looked at her and saw something threatening, not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. A woman who knew her rights, who knew her value, who wouldn't shrink." He paused again, voice steady, weight in every syllable. This wasn't fear. This wasn't procedure. This was punishment. For daring to speak. For not flinching. For being unapologetically human. In a place built to silence people like her. Behind him, Talia held up the printed photo, still from the footage, Delilah with her hands down, peaceful, mid-sentence. It was grainy, but her expression said everything. Composed, cornered, trying to reason with someone who'd already made up their mind. Shaq pointed to the image. "This is the last face she made before being tased. This is the woman you called combative. This is what you erased from the record. But now the record plays itself." The crowd began to murmur, growing louder. Journalists huddled near their field producers, receiving live feeds as the footage dropped online. Phones buzzed, screens lit up. News anchors back in studios scrambled to adjust scripts. A local network abruptly cut from weather to the raw video, the truth now owned by the people, not the state. And then, as if summoned by that exposure, the city flinched. At 10:02 a.m., the mayor's office released a rushed press statement, not addressing the footage directly, but offering regret over community distress and a promise for internal evaluation of officer conduct. Shaq looked into the nearest camera and responded in real time. "No, this isn't about regret. This is about responsibility. You don't get to mourn the fire when you're the one who lit the match." That was the moment something cracked. Not in him, in them, in the facade, in the orchestrated control they thought they had over the story. The crowd erupted, not in chaos but in clarity. Voices shouting justice for Delilah, release the names, no more hiding. Students from Marist College unfurled a massive banner. "She told you. We believe her." Faith leaders took the mic. Lawyers began reading from Delilah's zoning files, highlighting inconsistencies that were now being linked to bribes and private land acquisitions. Within an hour, national news anchors were calling it the O'Neal shift. The moment a celebrity's grief had morphed into a social reckoning. But Shaq didn't want the spotlight. He left the steps quietly, slipping through a side door, back into Delilah's room, where the hum of machines reminded him, this wasn't a movement built on abstract ideas. It was built on her. He sat down beside her again, the noise from outside distant but constant. Then his phone buzzed, an encrypted message. "No sender ID. They're going to try to settle. Don't take it. Dig deeper. You're not done yet." Attached was a list of sealed internal records, connections between Officer Knox and 3 city contractors, under federal scrutiny. The video was only the beginning. Now the trail pointed to money, corruption, collusion. The system hadn't just protected Knox. It had employed him as a weapon. Shaq exhaled and looked at Delilah. "You started this fire," he whispered. "Now they're burning their own house trying to smother it." Outside, someone spray-painted across the barricade. "She told you who I am." The 5 words had become a signal, not of fame, not of fear, but of refusal. A refusal to be erased. Refusal to be blamed. Refusal to go quiet. And as the city scrambled to patch its bleeding image, Shaquille O'Neal didn't smile. He prepared. Because the trial wasn't just coming. He was going to build it. Behind sealed chambers and silent phones, powerful men panicked like cornered wolves. Power doesn't scream when it's scared. It whispers, delays, distracts. And as the footage of Delilah's tasing carved its way across national airwaves and digital forums, the power brokers of Westworth didn't panic in public. They retreated behind frosted glass and conference room doors, spinning new narratives and rehearsing lines meant to dull the blade now pressed against their throats. By the second morning, Officer Brantley Knox was officially suspended pending investigation. But no one could find him. He'd vanished from his home, his car left at a park and ride on the county border. Internal Affairs issued a soft statement. The mayor's office insisted they were cooperating fully. But Shaq knew what was happening. This wasn't transparency. It was containment. Behind the headlines, The machinery of preservation had kicked in. Calls to federal contacts, meetings with media liaisons, firewalls raised around department servers. They didn't expect to be exposed. Now they were doing damage control, not just for Knox, but for the entire pipeline that enabled him. Supervisors who'd signed off on his reports, district attorneys who quietly declined to prosecute his complaints, judges who sealed records under community protection statutes. Shaq didn't have the luxury of hiding. He was in it now, too visible, too loud, too determined. He knew retaliation would follow. And it did. Anonymous threats flooded his team's inboxes. One message read, "Back off or your daughter's next." Another listed Lucille's full address, time-stamped photos of her grocery run attached. There was nothing subtle about it. The city offered protection, but Shaq knew better than to accept safety from the same hands that had written this chaos into law. So he took matters into his own. He relocated Mayara to a secure house 2 towns away, with trusted family. She didn't argue. She was smart, sharp like her mother, and understood that silence wasn't safety. But Lucille, she refused to move. "This is my home," she said. "They want me afraid. Let them come to my porch and find out who I am." Shaq didn't fight her on it. He knew better. Lucille was the kind of woman who stared down storms until they bowed. Instead, he doubled his security discreetly. Private firms, not police. He locked down his digital footprint, encrypted every file and rerouted every conversation through protected channels. Every step they took to suppress him was countered with a new platform, a louder voice, a clearer lens. The story had changed. It was no longer just about Delilah's footage. It was about how the system had functioned so efficiently to bury women like her. And now, with journalists digging through police archives, a rot was being exposed that had roots in everything: land deals, city contracts, housing permits, even court cases. Talia Grove unearthed a judicial order from 4 years earlier, sealing a wrongful arrest tied to a Knox case. The victim, a public housing advocate named Charmaine Bixby, had filed multiple motions, all denied, buried under paperwork. Her case file never left committee. She'd moved states, disappeared from the records. But the pattern was there, and it was the same blueprint. Knox was never rogue. He was recruited. He was the system's preferred tool. Not loud, not violent in appearance, but surgically precise in shutting down voices that rang too close to truth. One morning, Shaq received a private invitation to meet at the downtown courthouse. No media, no legal pressure, just conversation. He accepted, but walked in with Marcellus and Talia flanking him like bookends of law and message. They were ushered through a back hallway into a panel room. Inside sat 5 officials, city attorneys, an aide to the mayor, and a private mediator. They wore neutral expressions, masks stitched from decades of crisis management. One of them, a man named Daniel Cross, folded his hands and leaned forward. "We'd like to propose a resolution," he said, like he was offering Shaq a glass of water. Shaq didn't respond. Cross slid an envelope across the table. Inside, a settlement figure that would wipe out every fine, every complaint, every name. Million. And in return, Talia asked, already knowing. "No trial, no press. We handle Officer Knox internally. Delilah gets the best care, privately. You make a statement that this was a tragic misunderstanding, that you're satisfied with the reforms." Shaq stared at him for a long moment, then opened the envelope and slowly slid it back across the table. "Here's what I want," he said, his voice low. "Full public trial, federal oversight of the police department, subpoenas for every case Knox's name appears on, every judge, every prosecutor, all of it. Open court. You'll destroy this city," one of the women snapped. "No," Shaq replied. "I'll finally show people who's been running it." They ended the meeting in silence. Not a word of protest. Just the tension of people who thought their titles were bulletproof and suddenly realized they were made of paper. As the days unfolded, public momentum swelled. National figures began speaking out. Celebrities posted videos. Religious leaders held interfaith gatherings on courthouse steps. But the true weight of the movement wasn't in the noise. It was in the records. The documents. The undeniable mountain of proof rising behind Shaq and his team. A judge, once revered for his tough but fair stance on community crime, was found to have suppressed at least 6 misconduct complaints linked to Knox. City managers had signed off on surveillance orders. targeting protest organizers. The mayor's campaign received funding from a development firm Delilah had exposed for fraudulent zoning. Everything connected. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a culture. A culture that had operated behind polite smiles and ribbon cuttings. A culture that wore diversity pins while drafting exclusionary ordinances. A culture that had quietly built fences around power and painted them as public safety. And now that culture was combusting. The mayor, once confident, began canceling appearances. His spokesperson resigned. The chief of police went on indefinite leave. But Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. Because justice wasn't about watching people fall. It was about why they fell, and making sure it never stood up the same way again. One night, sitting at Delilah's bedside, Lucille walked in with a folder. She handed it to Shaq without a word. Inside was a document Delilah had drafted months earlier. Her plan to launch a public database of police encounters, tied to zoning areas. She called it Streetline. A living map of where voices were silenced, not just where crime was reported. Her handwritten note in the margin read, "If something happens to me, this still matters." Shaq felt the heat rise behind his eyes but didn't let it fall. Instead, he placed the folder beside her, kissed her cheek, and whispered, "It still matters. It matters more now than ever." And as the city spiraled in press conferences and apologies, he stood unmoved, carrying a new truth. They hadn't lost control. They'd never really had it. They just silenced the ones who pointed that out. But those days were done. Now the silence had a crack in it, and fire had found its way in. She opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was the city holding its breath. Morning sunlight poured gently through the blinds of room 418, casting long slats of gold across Delilah's cheek. Machines beeped rhythmically beside her, their cadence as familiar now to Shaq as the sound of basketballs bouncing through his childhood. He had fallen asleep sitting upright again, one hand still wrapped around hers, chin tucked into his shoulder. His body had learned to rest while remaining half awake, listening, guarding, praying. The world outside had changed since the day she last spoke. Cities now murmured her name beside others that filled headlines, etched on cardboard signs and hashtags. Not as another tragedy, but as a turning point. Since the video went public, since Shaq's words cracked the silence, the city had entered a strange purgatory, between reckoning and renewal. Decisions waited. Trials loomed. Knox was still missing, a ghost in a city that now screamed his name. Shaq stirred just as the silence shifted. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, just a faint rustle, then a whisper so soft it nearly broke him. "Water." He blinked once, then again, not believing it at first. Her eyes were open, blinking, slow, confused but sharp. She looked at him like she remembered everything. Shaq stood fast, called for the nurse with a voice too choked to rise above a whisper. Staff rushed in. Monitors were checked. A cup of water was offered, sipped carefully through a straw, and then it came. The moment that rewrote the atmosphere of the entire floor. Delilah spoke again. He smirked. He knew who I was. It wasn't a question. It was a memory. Full, vivid, unhindered. Shaq exhaled like his lungs had been clenched for weeks. The nurse nodded, her eyes wide. "We need to alert the investigators. Now." Within an hour, agents from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice arrived. The hospital's administrative wing became a security zone. Their questions were calm, but direct. Their faces unreadable. Delilah, though still recovering, was unwavering. She recalled the moments, exactly how Officer Brantley Knox had leaned into her personal space, how he ignored her explanation, how his eyes narrowed with recognition the moment she said Shaquille's name. "I knew I wasn't safe the second he smiled," she said. Her testimony triggered an immediate escalation. The Department of Justice released a public statement, confirming a formal civil rights investigation into the Westworth Police Department, and Officer Knox specifically. It was the kind of headline that reshaped a city's identity overnight. Probes expanded into prior cases. Media flooded the streets. Names previously erased from the record were unearthed and spoken again. And Shaq, who had refused to step into the political spotlight, now found himself at the center of a storm with no choice but to lead through it. He went on national television days after Delilah's awakening. No teleprompter, no styling team, just him and a microphone. He didn't speak as a celebrity. He spoke as a man whose wife had become a symbol for a system cracking under its own weight. "My wife told the truth, and she was punished for it." This isn't about one officer. This is about what's been allowed to exist beneath the surface for too long. And we're not asking for sympathy. We're demanding reform. His words were calm, but they landed like thunder. In the weeks that followed, peaceful protests swelled, not just in Westworth but in neighboring counties. The signs shifted from anger to vision. Protect our voices, policy not pity. Streetline lives. Delilah's proposed initiative, Streetline, was revived by community leaders, now funded through a national grant, and led by Talia Grove. The program mapped racialized police encounters and zoning decisions, showing in vivid data how enforcement and erasure often traveled the same roads. Mira, still in hiding for safety, began organizing from campus. She launched webinars, spoke to student journalists, turned her generation's outrage into outreach. Lucille became a fierce voice among senior advocacy groups, demanding transparency in municipal records. And Shaq, once the face of brand campaigns and post-game interviews, had become something else entirely. Not a martyr, not a politician. A mirror held up to a country still wrestling with the truths it pretended not to know. But even as the city shifted, one shadow remained. Knox. Despite multiple raids, warrants and task force searches, he had vanished. Theories swirled, that he was being hidden by sympathizers, that he had fled under a false identity, that someone powerful was ensuring he stayed out of court. Every sighting was a dead end. Every rumor deflated. And yet the pressure didn't wane. It grew. Public hearings opened. Officers testified under subpoena. A young dispatcher admitted to scrubbing a call log under directive. A city clerk confirmed she'd been told to lose evidence related to zoning cases. The puzzle assembled itself in plain sight, all tied back to Knox, who now represented not just an act of violence, but a system that depended on quiet compliance. Through it all, Delilah healed, slowly, steadily. The bruises faded, the internal injuries mended. But her voice had sharpened. She granted her first interview 30 days after waking up, sitting in a chair across from a national journalist. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just told the truth. I said those 5 words because I thought they would stop him. Not because my husband is famous, but because he's respected. I thought if I could remind that man I was someone's wife, someone's partner, he'd see me as human. He didn't. And that's the problem. The clip played for weeks. It ended with her staring directly into the camera, saying, "But I'm still here. And I remember everything." The city changed after that. Not magically, not cleanly, but meaningfully. Officers were retrained. Judges were reassigned. Whistleblowers were promoted. The mayor, now hanging by political threads, requested federal aid for department restructuring. The same mayor who had once dismissed community complaints as media noise. But even in this slow justice, Shaq never smiled with satisfaction, because one man still hadn't faced consequence. One name remained unaccounted for, until a call came in, not to the police, not to the press, to Shaq's private number, untraceable, voice masked. "He's not gone, just waiting. You'll know when. They always circle back." Click. Shaq didn't tell anyone about the call at first. He let it sink into his bones, sit behind his eyes like a weight he couldn't place. He didn't know who made it, didn't know what it meant, but he understood the rhythm of men like Knox. Power-drunk men didn't run. They watched. They waited, and when they thought time had softened the edge of truth, they tried to rewrite their part. But this time, time wasn't their ally. It was Shaq's, and he had the city behind him now. A city that had watched a woman open her eyes and choose, even in pain, to speak without fear. A city that had learned the power of listening to the people it used to overlook. And a city that would no longer mistake quiet for peace. The stage was set. The truth had spoken, and only one piece remained. It wasn't just one man on trial. It was the silence that let him exist. It began with a shuffle of papers, the creak of wooden benches, the low murmurs of journalists, lining the gallery like observers of a national confession. But as the bailiff called the courtroom to order, it was clear this wasn't going to be an ordinary proceeding. The trial of Officer Brantley Knox had become something else entirely, no longer just a case about a taser and a woman left unconscious. It had become a reckoning, stitched into every silent policy and every ignored complaint the city had tried to forget. Shaq stood in the back row when they brought Knox in. No cameras were allowed, but no lens could have captured what the room already felt. The man who'd once smirked behind mirrored sunglasses now looked thinner, not broken but brittle. His orange jumpsuit clung awkwardly to a frame that had been sculpted by authority but now sagged with the weight of exposure. He avoided eye contact with the gallery, but the weight of hundreds of stares pinned him down like gravity made personal. He pled not guilty. The words dropped like stones into the room, heavy with defiance and denial. But no one flinched. Not this time. Over the next 5 days, the courtroom became the city's soul, opened wide, and dissected piece by piece. Witness after witness took the stand, not just to speak about that day outside the zoning office, but to speak about patterns, records, documents, the quiet manipulation of language in police reports, the use of combative as an escape hatch for consequences, the phrase "I feared for my safety" used like punctuation across a dozen dismissed complaints. It wasn't just testimony, it was reconstruction of how truth had been paved over with bureaucracy, again and again, until it took a famous name and a viral video to tear up the road. On day 6, Delilah entered the courtroom. The room fell so still, you could hear paper shift on the judge's bench. Her face carried no makeup, no performance, just presence. Her gait was slow, deliberate, body still healing, but her eyes had lost nothing. If anything, they had sharpened. She took the oath, sat, adjusted the microphone, and then she told them everything. How she had walked into the meeting with the city planner that morning, expecting to discuss revised zoning lines. How Officer Knox approached her with immediate suspicion. How his posture told her she was not supposed to ask questions, not supposed to stand too still, not supposed to exist too freely. How she said 5 words out of fear, not pride. "I'm the wife of Shaquille O'Neal." Because in that moment she hoped that someone would see her humanity before reacting to her presence. And how instead he smiled. How she felt her body lock. How everything went white. There were no tears in her testimony. No dramatics. Just unshakable precision. She finished by looking at the jury and saying, "This wasn't about confusion. It was about control. And I was punished for not shrinking." When she stepped down, Shaq met her near the bench. He didn't touch her. Just stood beside her as they walked back to their seats. Her strength enough to fill the space between them. The defense tried. They brought up policy. Argued that Knox followed protocol. Claimed the situation escalated unpredictably. But every defense broke against the rocks of recorded evidence, and a community that had stopped accepting half-truths. For every technicality they clung to, another witness shattered it with fact. The final blow came from a former officer who testified under subpoena. He described informal briefings where officers were told which community activists to monitor, which zip codes to prioritize, and which figures to neutralize through pressure. Delilah's name had been mentioned, not as a threat, but as a target. When closing arguments finished, the jury deliberated for 5 hours. The city held its breath. Protesters and press waited outside the courthouse. Teachers canceled evening classes. Barbershops stayed open late, with TVs turned up high. And in homes across Westworth, families watched not for spectacle, but for vindication. When the jury returned, the court clerk read the verdict without a pause. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Brantley Knox, guilty on all counts." There was no eruption, no shouting, just silence. The kind that signals something tectonic has shifted under the foundation of everything. The judge delivered sentencing on the spot, 15 years. But more than the number was the context. In a rare move, the judge acknowledged in her remarks that this case illuminated a systemic failure that extends beyond any one man. What we punish today is not merely a single act, but the pattern that allowed it to occur. She ordered a federal oversight review of the Westworth Police Department. Court adjourned. Shaq did not celebrate. Delilah exhaled. And across town, murals began going up. Not of tragedy, but of resistance. A local artist painted one outside the zoning office. It showed Delilah's face, serene, eyes open, bathed in the warm tones of morning. Above her, 5 words looped across the wall like a prayer and a warning. "She told you who I am." The mural spread online. Within hours, news crews came not to interview, but to capture. Neighborhood kids took photos beside it. Nara, now returned from hiding, touched its base with her palm, whispering something to herself. The next day, Shaq stood with Delilah and Marara under a blue, cloudless sky outside the courthouse. No speeches, no victory laps, just their family. Whole again. Reporters asked if he had any final words. He looked at them, then at his wife, then said quietly, This was never just about us. It was about every time someone's silence was mistaken for safety. We spoke because we had to. But we're not done. Not until every courtroom sees what this one finally did. They walked away together, not as victims, not as heroes, but as people who had refused to disappear. And somewhere behind them, the city began learning how to listen again. If this story shook something in you, don't scroll past it. Carry it forward. Talk about it where silence usually wins. Question the systems built to forget people like Delilah. Be the reason the next 5 words don't have to come after pain. Because justice doesn't end in a courtroom. It begins in your voice.